Andy here. I'm a vintage home decor reseller, and today I'm going to give you a crash course on shipping. So when I was first starting my reselling journey, the idea of shipping was so intimidating to me. I almost didn't want to start because I just couldn't even think about having to ship anything large in a box like this. I had only ever basically mailed a letter in my life. So going from that to this seemed like a really big leap, but I'm here to say it's actually really, really easy. So a little bit about my business before we get started, because that's really going to kind of help give like a foundation for some of the tips that I have to go over, which I have a lot to share with you guys today. So I am a part-time vintage reseller, and I have been selling vintage for, gosh, I want to say like 5 years now, and I've shipped hundreds and hundreds of items. Most of the items that I'm shipping are kind of like what you see behind me. So like small decorative items, sometimes as big as a stool, but I do not ship furniture. I offer free shipping on most of my orders, whether someone buys through Etsy or if they buy direct from me, like let's say through like Instagram. And I also use recycled packaging materials anywhere I can. I try to keep my costs for my business really low. So here's what we're going to cover today in the shipping tutorial. So we're going to talk about packaging your items, and that includes the actual materials, the tools that I use, and then also ways to protect certain types of items that are kind of tricky to ship in transit just to make sure that they don't break. Next, we're going to talk about postage, why I offer free shipping, like what's the business strategy behind that, and where you should be buying your postage. And then of course, I'll share probably other tips and tricks along the way, because shipping, while it is very easy, I will say, and I'm hoping by the end of this video, you'll feel that shipping is easy. There is a lot to it, so I know you're going to learn a lot today. Okay, so let's jump right into it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is packaging, and we're going to go over the materials and tools that I use to package up all my orders. So these are actually the supplies. I have a lot of props for you guys today. These are actually the supplies that I use every day when I'm shipping stuff out. I have everything linked down below in my Amazon storefront. So if there's something that you see, you're like, ooh, I could really benefit from that with my reselling business, just know that if you click the link in my description below and you buy through it, I will get a little commission. I mean, I'm talking, it is little, but I thought I'd let you guys know just in case. But these are actually a lot of the tools that I'm using on the daily for shipping. So I like to keep my shipping process really streamlined. I also like to make sure I'm not overspending on supplies. So there are certain things you have to have if you're going to be shipping your own stuff from home. One is a scale. You have to have a scale in order to weigh your packages. Otherwise, you won't be able to buy your postage online. And buying your postage online is wildly cheaper than actually going into one of the carriers like the Postal Service or UPS or FedEx. You get a lot better rates when you buy them online. So the other supplies are probably pretty self-explanatory. You're gonna need packing tape. Just make sure you're buying high quality, heavy duty packing tape. Please, you cannot skimp on packing tape. I cannot tell you how many times I have I've run out of tape, and so I just run out to the dollar store and buy some tape. Huge mistake, because the tape splits and then you're like chasing around the end of the tape for like 20 minutes. It's not worth it. It's absolutely not worth it. So spend the money and get the really good tape. So something I actually got for Christmas, which is new, that I'm loving so much when I'm using it, is this cordless pair of electric scissors. It will actually cut cardboard. So if you're ever needing to build a box because you have an item that just doesn't fit in any sort of standard box and you kind of have to like Frankenstein one together, or you want to cut down a box to save in shipping costs, something like this is going to save you from having, I mean, you can use a box cutter, but it requires some like muscle. It requires a lot more than just turning this on. Okay, that was probably too loud. Turn it on, and yeah, away you go. And it literally will like right down. It is amazing, and I highly recommend them. So of course, a tape measure is something you're gonna need, because obviously measuring the dimensions of your package and weighing your package is what determines the postage. I definitely would recommend getting a tape measure that has all of the teeny tiny numbers on it, like the fractions and stuff, because that really just makes like taking down measurements so much easier than having to remember what all the little tick marks mean. Next, you'll need a Sharpie. I use a Sharpie because I write on the box, fragile, heavy, be careful. Now, can you get stickers for this? Of course you can. You can get stickers that you can just plaster on, but I'm really cheap and I don't want to pay for stickers, which I know probably sounds crazy, but like I said, I'm a very frugal business owner, so I usually just write like fragile on the box with a big Sharpie, and that's good enough. The last thing I use is painter's tape. And so what you'd use painter's tape for is to protect anything that is highly breakable or glass. And so if you have like a picture frame that has a glass insert, you're probably going to want to put some tape on that, and that will help give it structure. And then if it were to break in transit, God forbid, all the shards won't go everywhere because you'll have had enough structure and tape in there that will kind of keep them in place. So that protects the piece of art or the object, and also protects the person who bought the item from getting cut when they're opening it. So the reason I choose like painter's tape over packing tape is because this obviously is meant to be removable. So it's less likely to like leave residue, and it's less likely to kind of peel off any sort of finish that it may end up touching. So next we're going to talk about packaging materials. So like I mentioned earlier, I do not pay for any of my packaging materials, and I haven't for all the years that I have been selling, and for the hundreds and hundreds of items that I've shipped, I've managed to only ever pay for tape. So you may be wondering, how in the world am I getting away with that? And that's because I am hustling all the time to get free packaging materials. So I have asked every single neighbor on my block and any friend that I have, like very close living to me, to please save all their materials for me, and then I will come pick them up. Or if they're local to me, like my neighbor, she'll come and she'll drop them off on my front porch. So that's how I get all the packaging materials. Most people are very, very happy to give you them because they don't want to be bothered recycling them. And then some of the stuff that is very hard to recycle, like soft foam like this, or these air packets, people don't know what to do with them, and they hate the idea of just throwing them away. And so when they know someone's going to take them and reuse them, they're more than happy to give them to you. So one thing you may not know is you can pretty much use any type of shipping box for your packages. Even if it has label tape on it, even if it has the logo of like Amazon, it doesn't matter. The Postal Service and the other carriers like UPS and FedEx do not care. You can absolutely use these boxes for shipping. So some of the other things that I use to protect the items in my shipping obviously are the air packets. These are amazing because they do not add any weight to your shipping, which is critical because postage is expensive and it can go up with weight. And so keeping your item protected of something like this that is no weight is amazing. I also use any type of like foam, like this is pliable foam. I'll use this, any sort of packing paper. Like the brown packing paper is my favorite because it's really great at adding structure inside a package without actually adding too much weight. I'll use tissue paper, I'll use newsprint paper. One thing I don't use typically is actual newspaper. Now the reason why I don't use newspaper is because it can come off on your fingers and it can rub off on the object that you're shipping. So if you do decide to use newspaper, and frankly, I don't come across much newspaper anymore because no one's getting a hard copy newspaper. But if you do want to use it, or like the advertisements from the mail, just make sure that you're protecting the item that you're packaging, so that way you're not going to have the ink from that rubbing off on the item in transit. So the thing I use all the time are these Amazon bubble mailers. They're just really good way of getting bubble wrap without having to pay for bubble wrap, which as I told you, I do not want to pay for any of my packaging supplies. So these are everywhere. People have no idea what to do with these in terms of recycling or throwing them away. So you can get these a lot from your neighbors, and they're a really great source of bubble wrap. So speaking of bubble wrap, my preferred bubble wrap always is the big bubbles. So the bubbles that are like this big versus like stuff like this where the bubbles are really small. That's because the bigger the bubble, the more protective they are, and you need less of that material to protect your item versus like something like this where you might need to wrap an item in, one of these or a few of these mailers several times. So I always recommend, if you can score any big bubble, that is definitely the best type of bubble wrap to protect your items. So a couple things you might be wondering at this point. One is, do people care that I'm using recycled materials? Because, obviously some of this stuff is very branded, super branded, and have I ever gotten complaints? And the answer is no. I have shipped hundreds and hundreds of items, and no one has ever complained that I'm using, something that is recycled and secondhand. I think a lot of people appreciate, obviously the sustainable aspect of my business. And I also let people know in my shop notes, like on Etsy, and I let people know when they're ordering from me that their item will probably come in recycled, packaging. And I have never had any complaints. So another thing you guys might be wondering is, Andy, why aren't you using the free boxes at the post office? And that is a very good question. So the reason I'm not using the free boxes at the post office is because I'm usually not using the postage that is required to actually use those boxes. So yeah, you can't just take a free box from the Postal Service and then not use the particular postage service that is designated for that box. So the post office offers several types of delivery services, and usually it's dependent on how quickly the item is going to get there and how it's traveling. Is it traveling by ground? Is it traveling by air? So all that makes a difference. And so the boxes, like the flat rate boxes and the priority boxes, I'm usually not buying the postage required to be able to use those boxes. And the reason I'm not buying that type of postage is because it's usually a lot more expensive than the postage that I can get shipping ground with a generic box like this. Okay, so now we're gonna shift gears and talk about how to keep certain types of items safe in transit, because I know that's something that people are really concerned about. Obviously, you don't want the stuff to break. So here I have some more props, new props, breakable stuff that I'm gonna show you. So the first thing is when I'm shipping like artwork or anything that can be punctured or you're worried about being scratched in transit, usually what I'll do is I will either, not only will I, of course, like bubble wrap this whole thing, sometimes I will put an extra layer just on the front of the artwork, or I'll even cut out cardboard and put it on there too. That way, if something were to happen to it, or let's say when the person's opening it, they're using a knife and they're just getting ready to like stab it, to protect against that, I usually add an extra layer of stuff right in front of the most vulnerable part of the package, or the item rather. And so for like artwork, that is this. So I will usually do a bubble mailer like this, or I'll actually cut out a piece of cardboard from just a loose box and I'll put it on top, and then I will bubble wrap around it. Baskets and other really delicate things like this that can easily be squished or cracked, I usually make sure I stuff any negative space that may be in the unit. And that's just something that you should do anyways. If there's negative space in an item, something like this, I usually put bubble wrap, or I'll put packing paper in just to keep it from bending. That way it has some resistance if it were to actually be squished in. And then another thing I'll do is anything that like this that can easily be bent like this, or in the case of this piece of pottery, see how it's a very delicate handle here, and it has a cute little thing on top. If I'm worried about these particular pieces being broken off, just because it's not always enough just to bubble it, sometimes you need something to protect delicate pieces or corners on something, I will actually take a piece of cardboard that usually I use my son's like snack boxes, and I'll just cut it up. So that's another thing that people are getting, is they're getting like gluten-free cracker box pieces. And what I'll do is I'll take a piece like this, I'll cut them down, and then I'll usually fold them, and then I will put them around something like this delicately, and that will give a little bit more, or you can wrap it like this, and that will give a little bit more structure to when you're bubble wrapping it. And that way this piece doesn't have any give, because this is protecting it over it. And then the same thing goes for baskets like this. I usually will actually cover this whole thing in some cardboard front and back, and that way it helps protect this particular piece from getting bent and folded when I'm packing it. So now that you have the item itself, bubble wrapped or protected, you need to, obviously find a box for it. So you want to make sure you're choosing a box that has enough room around the item to keep it safe, because if you put an item in a box and it is like touching the sides, that item could very easily break in transit, because anytime it gets banged around, it could shatter or it could get punctured. And so you want to make sure you're choosing a box that has enough room. So like for this particular basket, while this basket and box seem like this seems way bigger than this, it's actually a pretty good size because it fits nice in here, and there's still a lot of breathing room around the thing. So it won't, even if it got hit, it wouldn't probably touch the basket itself. And so you definitely are going to need to fill up any empty space that, that's around the item, because an item that is shifting and has any movement, so I always kind of do a little bit like this when I am checking the item, because you do not want it to move, because if it's moving, then it could be breaking inside the box, especially for breakables. So you never want them to be able to be moving around. And so just know that you'll need to fill up all this negative space. I use, obviously, a lot of these because they're really light, and, they're everywhere. I also use packing paper too. And then I always try to make sure there's like a nice cushion on the bottom. Then I'll set the item in, and then I'll pad around it. And then make sure there's like a decent amount of cushion on the top. And then you'll just seal it up. So one last tip before we move on to like purchasing the postage. If you have an item like this that has a lid, or anything that has like 2 pieces or more, you're gonna wanna separate out all the pieces. You would never wanna take this and then wrap it like that, because even if you wrapped it really tight, this thing is going to move like this when it shifts around. No matter what, even if you tape it down, there could be some movement and there could be some grinding. And that's obviously going to not only wear the finish of the item, and also could put stress on it, and it could break in transit. So I always separate pieces like this. This would be wrapped and this would be wrapped. And I make sure that they're close enough together so that way the person, when they're opening the box, doesn't think like, oh no, they forgot the lid. But that's one thing to keep in mind. Definitely separate anything that is 2 pieces or more, because you don't want them to break or hurt each other in transit. So now we're going to talk about all things postage. So we now know how to package an item and keep it safe and all the tools required to do it. Now we need to talk about postage. So this is the portion that I think intimidates everyone the most, is like, how do they know what postage to buy and where should they buy the postage? So we're going to get into that right now. So if you're going to the post office or FedEx or UPS to buy your postage, like the actual physical building, then you are overpaying on postage. So sites like Etsy or eBay or other reselling platforms are great places to buy your shipping labels, because they get discounted rates. And the reason they get discounted rates is because it's a volume game. Because so many people are using and buying postage through that site, then the site is given a discount. And so that is going to be huge for your customers who are paying for shipping, or for yourself if you're offering free shipping. So now would be a good time to tell you why I offer free shipping on my items. So the first reason is Etsy prioritizes free shipping. So any shops and listings that offer free shipping, you get priority placement in search results. So obviously that's important because you're going to get more sales. The other reason why I offer free shipping is because I never want the shipping to be a deterrent to a sale. I like my customers to kind of know upfront, generally, outside of sales tax, what an item's going to cost them, and not be surprised when they get to the screen that says how much shipping is going to be. This kind of mimics, obviously, the Amazon experience. Like if you have Amazon Prime, and also other like retail sites, shipping is often free. And so people are kind of expecting that. They have the free shipping mentality. And so I just usually bake in a shipping cost into the cost of the item. And that way the client knows exactly what they're going to be paying when they see the item. So because I offer free shipping, the cost of postage is very important to me, because that cost obviously is going to subtract from how much I make on that sale, because I bake the cost into my item cost. And so I always want to make sure that I'm using the best platform that's going to get me the cheapest shipping. So if it's an Etsy sale, I usually buy exclusively through Etsy, because Etsy gets priority rates like I mentioned. And if it's a sale through Instagram, I usually use something like Pirate Ship, because they also get priority and discounted shipping. So the cost of postage is dependent on many, many factors. We just talked about one, which was where you're buying your postage through. Do they get preferred rates or not? Another thing that determines, obviously, how much your postage is going to be is how big and heavy the item is. So you always want to make sure you cut down any dead space where you can, where it makes sense, because sometimes trimming off an inch in a box that has just too much space for the item can actually make a difference. So there's a lot of tutorials online on how to like cut down and modify boxes to make them cheaper. So I definitely would check them out. But just know the dimensions and weight of the package, and you can do a little bit of modifying, will definitely dictate how much you're going to pay in postage. Another factor is where you're shipping the item to, because depending on the distance, obviously that makes a big difference in the cost. If it's traveling several days or very far, then that is more expensive. So luckily I'm on the West Coast, and most of my packages are going to California, or they're going to Washington. Obviously Oregon shares borders, and so my packages are pretty inexpensive to ship. But if I have sales in like Florida or New York, or God forbid in like Maine, it can get a little bit more expensive. And so that's something you gotta think about, like where are you located in the US and where are you primarily shipping to? Because if, let's say you're on the East Coast and you're shipping primarily to California and you're offering free shipping, then you're gonna wanna make sure that you're padding the shipping costs in your item price accordingly. So like for me, most of my sales, are just beyond my border. And so I keep that in mind, knowing that, okay, so I don't need to add a ton because I'm not usually shipping to Florida very often. So every once in a while, I'll be surprised by how much something will cost to ship, because it will go somewhere very, very far. But most of the time, what I bake into the price of the item actually definitely covers what the shipping would cost. When you're buying your postage online, you're going to need to know several things. One is obviously the name and the address of the recipient. And then you're gonna need to know how much it weighs, which is where the scale that you have comes in. And then also you need to use your tape measure and you need to measure the box. So all those factors will determine all the different options that you have available in terms of shipping costs. Now, certain sites like Etsy will show you everything that you can use, even stuff that's like wildly expensive. Like if you wanted to somehow overnight it somewhere, they give you that option. So just know you may have to toggle between the different carriers because they may have a separate section for the Postal Service versus FedEx versus UPS. And so you want to make sure you go through each option and choose the shipping cost that makes sense for the item and what is the cheapest. Now for sites like Pirate Ship, they usually just hit you with like the cheapest method, and you can then go and toggle between the different carriers if you wanted to choose something different, but they usually just show you what the cheapest is and then you can go with that. Where Etsy will just give you like all the options and then you have to narrow down what is the cheapest and makes the most sense. So most circumstances, the Postal Service is going to be the most affordable way to ship your items, especially if you're shipping stuff like this that's smaller. But if you're shipping something bigger, like, I don't know, like a stool or a stand or something that's like almost is getting into like furniture territory, like a duffel bag size item, then you might want to look at FedEx or UPS because then they will typically have the more affordable rates. Now, one warning with FedEx. So recently, when I've been buying my FedEx labels through Etsy, FedEx is then hitting me with overage fees like several days later saying that I did not measure and weigh my package properly, even when I have confirmed the measurements with the person in the store when I go to drop it off after buying the postage. Now, luckily, Etsy will refund any disputed fees from their carriers. Thank God. But I just want to give you that warning because this is happening to a lot of us resellers, that it's almost like some sort of bait and switch where they're like enticing us with a lower shipping rate only to then try to nail us later on down the line with more fees, and fees that can sometimes make shipping the item at all just not affordable. So just kind of a little bit of a warning. So use FedEx just knowing that there could be a chance where they may try to like almost like scam you down the line. So the next thing I want to talk about is insurance, and do I insure my packages? Yes, I insure my packages through third-party service providers. I don't usually rely on the baked-in insurance that's offered by the carrier, and I'll give you a few reasons in a second. So anything that is very breakable, I always insure, and then anything that is like if the order is a large amount of money, I usually will insure it then, even if it doesn't have anything breakable in it. I just want to make sure that I am never going to be losing out on, you know, the profit of that item because of something happening in transit. Now, most postage comes with built-in insurance these days, so you get like $100 worth of insurance and, you know, any shipping label. But the problem with that is it usually requires your customer to take the item and the box and all the packaging into, like, let's say the post office local to them, and then they have to help you with the claims process. I never want to put a customer through that. That seems like a lot of work and a huge burden on them. Not only did the item break and they're sad, I'm like holding them hostage and making them part of the process of getting a claim in. That just doesn't seem fair. Doesn't seem fair to them. I would hate that if I was the customer. And so I use third-party service providers for my insurance because they really streamline the process. And usually what's only required is just for your client or customer to give you pictures of the box, pictures of what broke, and then you take those pictures, you send it in, and then the fulfillment on that claim happens very, very quickly, rather than having to have everyone going in and doing all these things and waiting and waiting and waiting and then hoping you get a refund and get paid. So I always recommend using like a low-cost third-party insurance provider. Now, a lot of platforms will actually have it built in, like Etsy, you just have to opt in. If you use Pirate Ship, you just have to opt in. And you just have to tell, you know, the platform how much you want. Usually it's like 80 cents for every $100 worth of value. And so it doesn't add that much onto your labels. And because you're already using a low-cost shipping provider, you're already saving a little bit of money, and that can help. Then that will help offset the cost of maybe adding a little bit more insurance. But anytime an item breaks, and it's very rare that I have an item break, but when I have, I've always was so grateful that I had the private insurance versus using what was offered by the Postal Service. So last thing I want to talk to you about is how to store your shipping supplies. Now, some of you may be thinking, wow, Andy, your shipping area is so beautiful and aesthetic. Yeah, no, I do not ship in this room. I keep this room beautiful and clean and I ship in my garage. The reason I'm not showing you my garage is because it is dark and old and dingy and ugly and depressing, and it has just one little light source, and I was not going to bring like a light kit out there just to show you my very, ugly shipping station. But I will give you some tips on how to store your boxes. Now, one thing that may surprise you is that I keep all of my boxes intact. I do not break them down or cut them down for storage. And the reason why is because it's very hard for me to choose a box visually if I don't actually see what the box is going to look like in terms of shape. It's so much easier for me to select a box if I can see the item and see the box it's going to go into, rather than a bunch of flat packed boxes. So I'm lucky I have enough space to kind of store all my mishmash of boxes in my garage. But if you're short on space and you do need to flat pack them by breaking them down, you can actually write on the box itself what the dimensions are. Like just before you break it down, measure it out so that way you know, and then make sure you organize all your flat boxes, by size and kind of type. And that way, when you're looking for a box, when you sell something, even though you can't visually see what size it is, you'll be able to look at the label and be like, oh, okay, yeah, that should fit the dimensions of this based on the measurements. So the other reason why I keep my boxes largely intact is because I'm too cheap to tape them back together. Because yes, if you break them down, you're gonna have to tape them back together again, and you're gonna go through twice as much taping. I'm a very frugal business owner and I don't want to do that, so that's another reason why I keep them intact. Okay, so I'm looking at my notes and I realized there's a couple things I forgot to mention as we were going through each of the steps of the process. So the first thing is, if you don't have access to free boxes like me, because let's say you're not getting Amazon packages as frequently as I am, or your neighbors aren't, or you live somewhere rural and there's just not boxes around, you can absolutely buy your own packaging materials. There's plenty of websites online where you can buy boxes in bulk from. You can go to U-Haul or shipping companies, they have boxes. You can actually go into, the Postal Service and FedEx or UPS, and they'll have boxes for sale. So there are ways to buy boxes that are new. I just, obviously prefer to use the used ones because it's a lot cheaper, and there's plenty of them where I am. But if you don't have access to free boxes, there are definitely places that you can purchase them. So something you might be wondering is, do I have a designated box for every item that I sell? Because I know for like clothing resellers, they'll come home from sourcing, they'll list the item, and then they'll automatically package the item even before it sells. That is something that I don't do, and I think it's hard to do kind of with vintage. I usually don't package the item until it sells. I don't necessarily have a designated box unless it's a very one-off unique thing. Then I will find a box and I will basically designate that box for that item. But generally speaking, on the stuff that I'm shipping all the time, I don't know what box I'm going to put it in until it sells. Now, one hot tip from another reselling friend is anytime they source anything very unique, they will go to a store and actually buy a box for that item. That way they don't have to worry about making a box or finding a box. They will just already have a designated item, and then the cost of that box will then also be baked into the cost of the item that they're going to be selling. So that is a technique. It's a smart technique, rather than me where I just once the item sells, I'm scrambling, to make sure I make a box or find a box. That's something that if you have the foresight to do it, I definitely would recommend that strategy. It's just not a strategy I'm ever able to use. So one thing I totally forgot to mention when we were talking about postage is how I actually put the postage on the box. Am I printing it? Am I using a label maker? I'm sorry, that totally slipped my mind. So I'm actually very old-fashioned at the moment, and I am printing my labels out on a printer, and then I'm cutting them out, and then I'm taping them on. It's not very efficient, and the only reason I'm doing it is because I already had the printer, and I already had the paper, and I already had the toner. So it just made sense to just go with the supplies that I was using and already had before I kind of upgraded to that next step. But if you're starting out, and especially if you do not have a desktop printer, I would definitely invest in one of those label printers, because they're so much easier. The labels themselves are very, very cheap. So once you get the unit itself, which can be wildly expensive. So in my Amazon storefront, I linked two that I'm considering. One is the very expensive one, and the other one is more of an entry inexpensive one. And I might start with that first, but I would definitely recommend starting there if you don't already have a printer. But if you do have a printer, you can just do what I do, exhaust all of those office supplies before you start upgrading. Okay, so that's what I have to share with you today. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. I'm sure there's things that I forgot, so if you have any questions, definitely comment below. Any of the supplies that I mentioned in the video are linked below in my Amazon storefront. Thanks so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in my next video. Take care.